Good morning, Anatomy and Physiology, the intro class. We have today Jeffrey with us. He is the youngest dog I have, although he's like 8, so all my dogs are pretty old. And he is definitely the dumbest. But it's the morning right now, and he is always super sleepy in the morning, and he's so cute when he's sleepy. So we'll enjoy his company for today's lesson, which hopefully will be pretty short. So we're going to talk about the structure of a neuron and then the different types of neurons that we find in the body and what their role is in our body. So the neuron is kind of our main way that our body sends signals to the rest of our body. All right, so we are in your study guide packet. You are just going to be on the first page today. We're not going to do any other pictures on here, but the first page of that study guide packet, you should see this picture. So let's go through and label some few things on here. So a neuron is a cell, just like, we talk about in biology, your typical cell, and it has all the organelles that cells do. So it's going to have a nucleus and mitochondria and Golgi apparatus and rough ER and all those things. But it also has special structures that send signals to the rest of the body. So it has kind of this unique structure. It almost is sort of like imagine a hand where this part, in fact, I'll do it this way so it matches the picture a little bit. This part right here, okay, is the main part of the cell or the cell body. This is where most of the organelles are going to be. And then this part, my forearm here shooting off, which is this entire length right here, all of this is the axon. And so when a signal gets sent, and if you notice we have our label lines, but there's arrows too. If it were me at home and I had a highlighter handy, every single one of these arrows, I might trace over with like a yellow highlighter. Yellow, because it'll come up again later. I'm going to use yellow oftentimes to sort of show how impulses get sent. And so you might highlight these little tiny arrows in yellow and then the arrow coming down this way, because when we are sending a signal from our brain to my arm to flex my arm, or maybe to pick up my tea cup this morning. Oh, what's that say? My teacher is a rock star? Oh, when I do that, the signal gets sent from my brain down my axons, always from the cell body towards the end, which is the cell terminal at the very end. So that's kind of the basic structure. We've got kind of the main part here, cell body, where all the organelles are going to be, and then the axon is the piece that shoots off, and it's going to send the signal down. So important things in that cell body. So like my hand, my fingers here are going to represent the dendrites. The dendrites, that's all these little tiny arrows here. They are receiving signals from nearby neurons they're passing. It's sort of this game of telephone where they're passing the signal from one cell to the next. Other things in the cell body, we of course have a nucleus. That's the large portion in the center, the nucleus of our cell body. Oh, by the way, you might also, after cell body, put in parentheses and write the word soma, S-O-M-A. I'm sorry, I don't have it typed out on here. But that's the special word for the cell body of a neuron. It's called the soma. Same thing. If you see that word instead or in addition to, cell body is the soma, especially on a neuron. It's a special name it gets. All right, so we have the nucleus, we have mitochondria. Those are the little orange guys in there. And then we also have this thing called the Nissl substance. Sorry, my little box is covering it up a little bit. NISSL substance. And that's the fancy word for the rough ER of our neuron. So it's the rough ER, which, if you can remember back to Bio 1-2, rough ER was what packages up proteins. So as the nucleus is making proteins through the ribosomes, which this definitely has, although we don't have it labeled, then they get shipped out to the Golgi apparatus where they get pumped out. And so any proteins that your neuron needs is going to be made by your this little substance, or at least helping prepare that to be shipped out. And then this little line right here, if you notice really faintly, there's these horizontal sort of fibers right here. Those are called the, I went ahead of myself, the neurofibrils. So think they're little fibers, and so they're fibers of the neurofibrils. And then the other thing that just uncovered here is the axon hillock. The axon hillock, if you think of my hand again, would be like my wrist. It's essentially where we transition from the cell body into the axon. So kind of where my wrist is, that's what the axon hillock is, essentially where it's attached. And those fibers are there to give it some support. We don't want like your cell body to break off really easily from your axon. And so it's this extra structure and support in there, in that neck of the neuron. All right. And all right, coming down the axon. So the axon is this entire thing, okay? It's the whole, like if you look here, the yellow tube running through the middle, that's the axon, the whole thing. So some pictures sometimes label like a big bracket referring to this whole section here as the axon, okay? Not just this one tiny spot right there. So sometimes, not always, but sometimes a neuron might merge with another neuron where they form these connections. And so that's called a collateral branch, where the two are kind of connected to each other. And then if you notice, there's these like blue things wrapped around them. Those blue things that are wrapped around them, that's the Schwann cells. So this is representing just a single Schwann cell. So obviously there are a whole bunch of Schwann cells all over this. If that name sounds vaguely familiar to you, in Bio 1-2, you learned about the cell theory, that all living things are made of cells, and the cell is the basic structure of unit and function of living things, and all cells come from pre-existing cells. When you learned about the cell theory, you learned about the scientists responsible for that. One of those scientists was Theodor Schwann. There was Schleiden and Schwann, and Schleiden really liked plants and Schwann really liked animals. Well, it's this same Schwann that discovered the Schwann cells of the neuron, and so these are named after him. So if that name rang a bell, it's just a fun fact for you today. Huh, Jeffrey? He's not interested in the Schwann cell. But what the Schwann cell does, I'll come back to this structure here, but the Schwann cell ends up forming this thing, like a fatty covering around the axon. Think of it like insulation. So like I have my mouse here, okay? And inside of here, if I were to cut it, my mouse wouldn't work anymore, but I would see wire. And the reason why it's not just exposed wire is because it would kind of give me a little bit of a shock. Otherwise, this little insulation right here kind of protects the signal that's getting sent from my computer to the mouse so that they can communicate to each other. Think of those Schwann cells as this insulation, the rubber on the outside of a wire. But if you notice, it's not continuous, much like the wire of my mouse. Instead, it's clumped, and there's these little spaces in between them. Those spaces are called the nodes of Ranvier. It's French named after the scientist that discovered it. And those little gaps are really important for sending the signal to the other cells. Do you guys see that he's sleeping and trying to run? That's very cute. And so those little gaps in between there are what basically allow a signal to get sent more quickly. Kind of similar to my mouse, if it wasn't insulated, then the little signal would like zap out in the wrong direction and it wouldn't get sent to my computer. It doesn't work entirely the same way, but it's very, very similar. So these Schwann cells, they form what's called the myelin sheath. And that's really what I want you to label here is myelin sheath, or maybe underline that if you wrote all that down. So the Schwann cell, notice how it has actually have, each of these has a nucleus, that little purple dot in there, that's the nucleus. of them. And that little nucleus, it's a cell, but it's going to actually produce this lipid, this fatty covering or insulation. And so the myelin sheath is the actual fatty substance. If you looked at plan book, I listed some page numbers. There's a really great picture in your textbook showing the Schwann cell and the myelin sheath. It almost looks like pigs in a blanket, if you ever had that before. So it's like that little pastry that's wrapped around a hot dog, or a little tiny hot dog at least. Think of that. It's like this layer and layer and layer. If I were to take something and wrap it multiple times around it, that's kind of what the myelin sheath does. It sort of wraps it multiple times. So check out your textbook for a good picture of that. And then the last little label that we have on here is the very end, the axon terminal. So the terminal of anything, if I say I'm going to your job's been terminated, that means it's over, right? It's the end. Or if you've ever been to an airport and they say like your plane is at terminal F or whatever, and you got to find that end of the airport. And so it just means end. So the axon terminals are just the end of the axon. They branch off kind of like a dendrite, but not exactly. And we will focus in on axon terminals when we talk about how neurons stimulate other things, like say my muscles to pick up my teacher is a rock star mug. And so that joining of the axon terminal to the muscles it controls or the neighboring neurons is important. So that is a basic neuron structure. By the way, you should write at the top of your page here, I don't have it on here, but right above this, say neuron and put it in a box or underline this so that you know this is a picture of a neuron. That's what this is. All right. So this is a simple neuron, the most common one that you'll see, but there are different types. And the picture underneath is showing our 3 different types of neurons, and they have different jobs and functions in our bodies. So do include the number. That'll come into play here in a minute. So we have the first one at the top. We're going to call it neuron number 1, is a multipolar neuron. That is what we drew up above. This is the most common one. And so that's why that's the one that looks similar to the picture up above. So this guy up here, the big one, is a multipolar neuron, just like number 1 down below is a multipolar neuron. Your bipolar neuron, okay, has 2 kind of poled ends to it. And then the unipolar neuron sort of has this goofy thing sticking up out of the middle. So let's talk about what these structures are. So we're going to basically label the cell body, the dendrites, and the axon on each of these and try to figure out where they are. To find the cell body, you look for the nucleus. And I think in all 3 of these, you might be able to really quickly figure out where that is, the little circle, the purple circle. So we got one here, we got one here, we got one here. So to make your labeling easier and faster, you can write CB if you want for the cell bodies. But remember, that's just this whole part here where the nucleus is and all of those organelles that are important for the neurons' functionality and to stay alive. All right, and then we have what we're going to label next here. Oh, excuse me. The unipolar neuron is kind of unique because that cell body kind of comes up. It has its own little stem where the other 2 doesn't. And so they call that the single process of the cell body. Only unipolar neurons have those. All right, so the next thing we're going to label on each of these is the dendrites. Okay, so my fingers on this example here. So, those labels are goofed, you guys. I'm sorry. Flip-flop these 2. I'll make sure and fix it on the PowerPoint here. But make sure and change. This should say dendrites, and this should say cell body. Sorry, I just realized that. All right, but on the other one, okay, this one's kind of goofy. So are these the dendrites or these the dendrites? Because they're not coming straight off the cell body. Bipolar neurons are unique and kind of rare. So this this long process here, and then this more spidery stuff on the end, that whole section is the dendrites of my bipolar. And then on this one, okay, my dendrites are on this end. It would be difficult for you to, unless I told you which end is which, to identify this on its own. But if they kind of seem a little bit more spindly, less of a rounded tip, the axon terminals tend to have more rounded tips. So this is the axon terminal, axon terminal, axon terminal for each of these. So let's label the axon on each of these. So like the long process coming down, so the axon, we'll put an A on. So if this was the dendrite end of my bipolar neuron, this is my axon end. And then the unipolar neuron is weird. These are the dendrites and these are the axon terminals. But notice how the Schwann cells are included all the way down this. That makes this entire process right here the axon. And so it'll make more sense when we come back to this later, but I want you to label the two parts of this axon appropriately. So the one that's closer to the dendrite side is called the peripheral process. And when we see how this unipolar neuron works in your spinal cord and nervous system, it'll make a little bit more sense. But this is the part that gets stretched out into your peripheral portion of your nervous system. So the nerves and stuff coming off to the sides. Whereas the other portion of my axon that's closer to the axon terminals is the central process. And that's going to be more closer to my central nervous system instead of my peripheral nervous system. And we'll come back to that at a later time. So these are your three basic types of neurons. Don't forget, Mrs. Lloyd goofed here, flip-flop those. And make sure and have those labeled. Now, on your packet, you'll notice this one's a better example. You will see that there's some like empty space now right over here. Okay? The next little piece that we're going to put in is going to go there. But before I do that, I want to describe to you a little bit about how these different pieces of the neurons sort of work together. Make myself a little smaller so you can see. So we have our different types of neurons, and not every single neuron looks exactly the same. So over here, we have different types of examples of multipolar neurons. Like look at this one, it's got a crazy hairdo. That one has tons and tons of dendrites. Okay? This is a special type of one that you might find in your cerebellum. That's the portion of your brain kind of down here that helps with balance. And then this is like a pyramidal cell. So they have different structures. The bipolar, we've got some olfactory ones, so found in the nose, and then the retinal ones found in your eyes. They have different kind of look and feel to them. And then the unipolar ones, there's actually only really one place you find them in the body, and they kind of all look the same that way. But so this is just showing you that there's some variety to how they look. So as we just labeled the dendrite and the axon region on the other page, why that's important is because this part's in blue here is where it's receiving the information. So those arrows I asked you to highlight earlier on the other neuron, they were pointing all in the same direction. So those receiving the receptive area, this is where it receives the stimulus. And so that's why we labeled these as the dendrites, is because the signal would, if you wanted to like draw an arrow, you're welcome to on your three pictures we just labeled here. You could draw an arrow going from here down to this way, because this is the receptive area. And then the axon acts as the conducting region. So just like my wire is conducting a signal from my mouse to my computer screen, your neuron conducts the signal down to the axon terminals. And so why it's called a secretory region is because this is where the neurotransmitter gets released. So these little blue dots here are chemicals being released from those axon terminals, which stimulates you to pick up my teacher's a rock star mug, right? Or Jeffrey to readjust his body so he can get super comfy in the chair. All right, so maybe just draw an arrow down and along each of those neurons that we just labeled here. So you could draw an arrow going this way, and another arrow going that way, and another arrow going this way. Again, fix that. All right, and so there's all this empty space on your packet right here underneath our neuron. We're going to write something down. I'm going to go back over this, so don't copy it all down yet, but we're going to use that space for something else. I would recommend using 2 different colors on here. Like on mine, way back when I did this, I used like blue, teal and blue or whatever. They were just 2 different color pens I had handy. If you like to write in pencil, you could go back and highlight these or whatever, or box them, however you see fit. But I want you to distinguish between our structural differences of our different types of neurons and the functional differences. Just like when we made our graphic on the back of how the neuron system works, we talked about the structural and functional differences between our organization of the nervous system. So giving yourself a little bit of space here, because we're going to add, some more things in here, maybe about like at least 2 lines of writing space in between each one, is write each one of those neurons down. So the multipolar we called number 1. Let's keep those numbers consistent. The bipolar was number 2, and the unipolar was number 3. So structurally, what are they used for, and what kind of neurons, and where do we find them in the body? So if you remember from our talk on Monday, we discussed that you have motor functions, muscle movements of your nervous system having an action, and then you have a sensory function where it receives information from the world around you. So I can motor and pick up my coffee mug, but the sensory information sending to my brain tells me my tea's a little lukewarm at this point, but I can taste the lovely flavor of it still. So the multipolar neurons, they are used as motor neurons. So whenever I told my arm to pick up and grasp my coffee mug, that was a motor neuron, or efferent. If you remember, we used that word on Monday. Efferent is the neurons being sent to have some kind of action or effect. That helps. Efferent for effect. They have an effect on the body. They are also used as interneurons. We will come back to that later, but an interneuron is basically a neuron in between 2 other neurons. The bipolar neurons, they are only found in the eyes and the nose. They are just sensory, or the special senses. So what you could also write, kind of right over here between the eyes and nose, you could say special senses. They're only found in the special senses of the body. And then the unipolar neurons, they're only found in one area. They are the sensory neurons. So when I picked up my mug, that was a multipolar neuron sending that signal. But when I tasted my mug and I sensed the temperature of it being lukewarm and I tasted the flavor of it, those were all unipolar neurons sending that signal back to my brain. Sensory or afferent neurons are sending the new information. And then, okay, so that's their structure, like where we find them in the body. The function of each of these ties back into these. Now, pay attention to the numbers here. It's not a typo. So multipolar neurons, okay, number 1, have 2 different functions. So they can function as a motor neuron or an interneuron, which we've kind of already went over. And then unipolar neurons, their function is sensory, okay? So these are actually like where we find them in the body, but their functions. Multipolar neurons, they have a motor function or a connecting function. They're in between the other 2. And the multipolar neurons, their only functionality is to sense the world around me. So again, tasting how my tea tastes, or the temperature, or even just touching. Okay, what does it feel like when I touch my mug? So although that sounds like it's the same thing, the structure is where I find it in the body and what it looks like. The function is what does it do. Okay. Notice that I don't have number 2 on here. It is kind of a sensory function, right? Like receiving information from my eye and my nose. So I guess bipolar is sensory, but it's only in those 2 places of the body, nowhere else. So not even my taste buds of my tongue, nothing about touch, none of those. So only those 2 places, but it would technically be sensory as well. So you could kind of say like 2/3 here if you really wanted to. Okay. So this is just showing our neurons with where and how they function in the body. So this is my multipolar neuron. It would be this neuron here in red. Notice how it's going this right here, that's the spinal cord. And so it's going from the spinal cord out to my muscle to send some signal. My bipolar neuron, like I said, it's only in my eyes or my nose. These are in the very back of my retina, and they receive the information, they tie in with your cones and your rods so you can, what you visualize. You only find them there as well as in your nose. And so they send that signal to the brain. So it's not exactly a sensory neuron because it doesn't connect all the way to the brain or the spinal cord, but it does receive information in your special senses. And then the last one is my my sensory neurons, which are my unipolar neurons. And these ones, notice the impulse, the arrow direction, they go from me touching my cup and feeling, what it feels like to feel it, or the table or my mouse or whatever. And it's sending that information to my spinal cord and then up to my brain. Okay. And that's it. Okay. That's our notes for today. Make sure and go do your homework assignment while this is nice and fresh. The front page of your notes packet hopefully should be all filled out for you. Message me, email me if you have any questions. I miss you and I hope you're doing well. Bye-bye.